From the moment you could walk and speak, someone was already laying out the roadmap of your life, a carefully drawn path paved with standardized tests, classroom bells, and scripted milestones. And maybe you never questioned it, because questioning wasn't encouraged. You just followed, like most of us did. Kindergarten turned into first grade. First grade became middle school, then high school, then college. 16 years or more, your entire youth wrapped in the rhythm of school days, semesters, final exams, and quiet summer breaks that still carried the weight of what's next. But how many of those years were actually about you, your mind, your truth, your unique way of seeing the world? Not many. Because most of those years weren't about discovering who you are. They were about learning how to become what the world told you to be. Memorize this, repeat that, sit down, raise your hand, stay inside the lines. And so you did. You were praised for coloring inside the box, not for drawing your own. Maybe you were one of the good students. You got the gold stars, the high marks, the scholarships. Maybe your parents were proud, and teachers nodded with approval. But even then, wasn't there a small voice inside you, a flicker of something unsettled, that whispered, "This isn't enough"? That underneath all the praise, something essential was missing? You were taught how to show up on time, how to complete tasks, how to memorize formulas, and how to chase goals that someone else defined. But were you ever taught how to feel, how to listen to your inner world, how to question the very structure you were excelling in? Probably not. Because those questions make people uncomfortable. They don't fit in rubrics or standardized answers, and so the system didn't make room for them. It shaped you into a performer, a producer, a box checker. It handed you a script, then applauded you for reading it well. You entered adulthood with your hands full, degrees, credentials, a resume that says you're ready. But ready for what? Ready for a world that expects the same performance you gave in school. Ready to meet deadlines, to submit reports, to follow protocols. But when life throws something raw and real at you, loss, heartbreak, an identity crisis, what tools were you given to face that? Most of us weren't given any. We were told how to calculate the area of a triangle, but never taught how to sit with grief. We were graded on how well we followed directions, but never on how deeply we understood ourselves. And now that you're grown, you find yourself moving through life like a puzzle piece that doesn't quite fit. You may have a job, a home, stability, but you wake up some mornings and wonder why you feel so far from whole. This isn't a failure of yours. This isn't about personal shortcomings. This is the result of a system that was never built with your soul in mind. The modern education system was designed with one goal: to produce efficiency, not wisdom, not depth, not purpose. It was structured during a time when factories were booming and governments needed predictable citizens who could show up on time, take orders, and keep the wheels of industry spinning. So schools were modeled like production lines. The bells mimicked factory shifts. The rows of desks mirrored assembly lines. The rules echoed industrial discipline. And slowly, the natural curiosity that children are born with, the wonder, the wide-eyed fascination, was smothered. Instead of being nurtured, it was managed. Do you remember the first time you asked a question that wasn't in the textbook? Maybe the teacher brushed it off. Maybe you were told to stick to the lesson plan. Maybe you learned right then that thinking too much made people uneasy, that going off script got you labeled as difficult. And so, like many, you adapted. You stopped asking. You gave the right answers. You played it safe. You didn't want to be the problem. You wanted to be praised. And praise came from compliance, not courage. From fitting in, not standing out. But here's the cost. When you bury your questions, you bury parts of yourself. And now, years later, those buried parts are resurfacing, Not loudly, not all at once, but quietly, like an ache. A soft restlessness that rises in the silence of your life. After the workday ends, after the kids are asleep, after the world quiets down and you're left alone with your thoughts. That's when it hits. The realization that you've been living by a script you didn't write, that the success you've achieved feels strangely hollow, that you've built a life but not necessarily your life. The system didn't mean to do this. It wasn't designed with cruelty. It was designed with a different purpose, to create order, to maintain stability. But in doing so, it sacrificed depth for control. It favored predictability over individuality. It rewarded conformity while punishing complexity. And now, we're left with the emotional residue. Grown adults who know how to meet deadlines, but not how to sit with their own sadness. Professionals who can manage teams, but not their own anxiety. Parents who can schedule every minute of their child's day, but don't know how to answer when their child asks, "Why do I feel so alone?" We were taught how to act, not how to be. How to solve problems, not how to understand ourselves. How to achieve, but not how to connect. So we chase achievements hoping they'll make us feel whole. We accumulate things, experiences, accolades, but the wholeness never arrives. Because no amount of external success can fill the void left by a life unlived inwardly. And the truth is, many of us don't even know what wholeness would feel like, because we were never shown. We were trained to move forward, not to look inward. To get somewhere, not to ask why we're going. It's not just the content that was lacking in school, it's the approach. Real learning is not about memorization, it's about discovery. It's not about fitting into a box. It's about expanding beyond it. But the system, in its need for order, could not afford that kind of freedom. So it trimmed your edges, rounded your questions, flattened your curiosity. It needed you to be manageable, and you complied. Not because you were weak, but because you were young, because you wanted to be seen, because you didn't know there was another way. But there is another way. And it begins not with rebellion, but with reflection. Not with burning the past, but with understanding it. When you begin to trace the lines of your own conditioning, you start to see how much of your life was inherited, not chosen. You see how your fears of failure, your discomfort with rest, your addiction to productivity, none of them are your fault. They're echoes of a system that taught you that your worth was measured in grades, in hours, in results. And breaking free doesn't mean rejecting everything. It means reclaiming what was always yours, your inner voice, your ability to wonder, your right to define your own path. The most radical act you can take isn't quitting your job or moving off the grid. It's this, sitting with yourself in silence and asking, who am I beneath all of this? And waiting long enough to hear the answer. Not the answer from a book or a podcast or a mentor. The answer from within. The one that was silenced in childhood. The one that tried to speak up when you were a teenager, but got buried under expectations. The one that's been whispering all along, there's more than this. This isn't about blaming your teachers. Most of them were doing their best inside a system they didn't design either. Many of them probably felt the same ache you feel now. The system shapes everyone. It turns passionate learners into passive workers. It turns inspired thinkers into efficient performers. It doesn't care about your soul. It cares about your output. But your soul is still here, and it remembers. It remembers the joy of discovering something new just because it lit you up. It remembers what it felt like to be fully present in a moment of awe. And it knows that the life you're meant to live can't be found in a curriculum. It must be carved from the inside out. It must be grown like a wild garden, not built like a machine. It begins with curiosity, with allowing yourself to wonder again, to ask questions with no immediate answers, to read not for utility but for beauty, to listen not for facts but for meaning, to feel not for efficiency but for truth. Because real education, the kind that changes you, the kind that heals you, the kind that brings you back to yourself, that education starts when you step off the path and ask, what do I really want to know? What do I need to understand before I die? And then you follow the questions like breadcrumbs, not to a destination, but to a deeper way of living. There's a point in every thinking person's life when they begin to sense that the map they were given doesn't match the terrain they're walking. You find yourself going through the motions, checking all the right boxes, doing what you were told would bring fulfillment, and yet you're not fulfilled. You have all the symbols of success, the job title, the steady income, the accolades from people who say they admire you. But when you look at yourself in the mirror, there's an unsettling distance between what you've built and who you really are. It's like living in a house that looks beautiful on the outside, but feels cold on the inside. And you begin to wonder if all the effort you put into climbing that ladder was spent climbing the wrong wall. That doubt, that soft voice inside, that persistent tug, that's not weakness. That's the beginning of awakening. The realization doesn't come all at once. It shows up in moments you don't expect. In a quiet evening when the noise of the world fades and all that remains is you and the silence. In the middle of a workday when you catch yourself staring out the window feeling something you can't name. In conversations where you nod politely but internally drift away because the words no longer mean anything to you. It's like your life has become a script written by someone else, and you're still acting it out because you were never given permission to change the lines. But the truth is, you never needed permission. You just forgot you had the power to choose. This forgetting didn't happen by accident, it was by design. From the earliest days of your education, you were trained not just to learn but to believe. To believe that the world is a place where obedience is safety, that following instructions is the same as being wise, that the measure of your intelligence is how well you memorize someone else's thoughts, not how clearly you think your own. And so you learn to value external validation more than internal alignment. You got good at fitting in, at getting approval, at not rocking the boat. And somewhere along the way, you lost touch with your own compass. Now you're here, an adult by every definition, but still seeking the kind of understanding no classroom ever offered. Because life is asking questions that school never prepared you to answer. What matters when everything falls apart? What gives you peace when nothing is certain? What do you believe when no one is telling you what to believe? These are not academic questions. These are questions of the soul. And the tragedy is that for all our years of formal education, most of us were never once asked to explore them. We were too busy being productive, too focused on performance, too immersed in the hustle to stop and ask, is this what I truly want? It's not surprising then that so many people walk around with quiet desperation, successful but unfulfilled, respected but restless. We've been taught to build resumes, not to build character, to chase promotions, not purpose, to win arguments, not to understand ourselves. And now that the structure of school is gone, now that there's no syllabus, no exams, no teacher telling you what's next, you're left with the realization that all those years were a rehearsal for a life you don't even want to live. And that hurts. Not because you failed, but because you followed so well. That's the paradox. You did everything right, and yet it feels wrong. You reach the milestones, yet something inside you still feels unfinished. It's like graduating from a race only to realize you were running in circles. The discomfort you feel isn't failure. It's the evidence that something deeper in you has survived, that your soul has not been completely buried under the weight of conditioning, that some part of you still knows this isn't it. And that knowing is precious. It's not a problem to be fixed. It's a signal that you're ready for something real. But real doesn't come easily, because unlearning is harder than learning. It's one thing to take in new information. It's another to dismantle the beliefs that shaped your identity. You begin to realize that much of what you took for truth was never examined, that your preferences, your ambitions, even your fears, many of them were inherited, passed down like furniture from previous generations. You start to ask, do I actually believe this, or was I just told to? And those questions, though unsettling, are the doorway to something greater than success. They're the doorway to authenticity. But authenticity has a cost. It requires you to let go of the mask, to risk being misunderstood, to trade comfort for clarity. Because the moment you stop performing and start being, the world around you reacts. People may question your choices. They may pull away. They may tell you you're changing and they're not wrong. You are. You're waking up. You're reclaiming parts of yourself that were silenced for the sake of fitting in. You're learning that self-respect matters more than approval, that presence matters more than performance, that peace is more valuable than praise. And it's not just your outer life that begins to shift. Your inner world changes too. You begin to notice how much of your self-worth was tied to productivity, how uneasy you feel doing nothing, even when your body is begging for rest. You start to realize that your constant busyness wasn't about ambition, it was about avoiding the silence. Because in the silence, all the questions come back. Who am I really? What do I need beyond what I was told to want? What would my life look like if it was built from the inside out? Those questions aren't easy, but they're essential. Because until you ask them, you're still living someone else's life. You're still operating on default settings. And there's nothing brave about performing a script you didn't write. The real courage is in standing still long enough to hear your own voice. The one that was drowned out by lectures and deadlines and the constant pressure to be something for someone else. That voice doesn't shout, it whispers, it waits. It speaks in the quiet moments when you stop pretending to be okay. You don't need more motivation. You don't need another productivity hack. What you need is permission. Permission to feel, to rest, to wonder, to not know. Because wisdom isn't about having the answers. It's about staying with the questions long enough for something true to emerge. And that kind of wisdom can't be taught in a classroom. It can only be discovered in solitude, in reflection, in those moments when you finally allow yourself to be honest. Not the polished version of honesty that gets applause, but the raw kind that leaves you exposed. There's power in that vulnerability. There's a kind of strength that only comes from facing yourself, from looking at the life you've built and asking, does this reflect who I am or just who I thought I had to be? And that question, once asked, changes everything. It begins a slow unraveling, not a collapse, but a reordering, the unlearning of old rules, the release of roles that no longer fit, the quiet rebellion of choosing your own path, even if it makes no sense to anyone else. And maybe that's the real purpose of education, not to train you for the world, but to help you create your own, not to shape you into a perfect cog in the machine, but to remind you that you were never meant to be a cog in the first place. You were meant to be a creator, a questioner, a being alive with wonder and truth. And anything that dims that light, no matter how well-intentioned, is not education. It's indoctrination. You don't need to burn down the system. You don't need to reject your past. But you do need to reclaim your present, to make space for the parts of you that were once silenced, to honor your curiosity, your confusion, your desire to feel whole. Because real learning doesn't come from being told what to think. It comes from the courage to think at all, from the willingness to sit with uncertainty, from the freedom to ask, what now? Not as a question of fear, but as an invitation to begin again. And the beauty is, you can begin at any moment. You don't need a degree. You don't need approval. You just need a breath, a pause, a willingness to let go of everything you think you're supposed to be, and to trust that what's underneath is enough, more than enough. Because the real you, the one who wonders, who aches, who dreams, is not lost, just buried. And with each question you dare to ask, you dig a little deeper. You uncover a little more. You remember what it feels like to be alive, not just functioning. This is your permission slip, not from a teacher, not from an institution, but from yourself, to stop performing, to start living, to trade achievement for alignment, to choose a life that feels true, even if it doesn't look impressive. Because the most impressive thing you can do is to become yourself, fully, unapologetically, deeply. And that journey, that sacred inward journey, is the education you've been waiting for all along. By now, you might be sensing something different in the way you see yourself, not because you've learned something new, but because you've remembered something old, something real. There's no map for this, no syllabus, no familiar structure to lean on. And that's exactly the point. Real growth doesn't follow a curriculum. It unfolds in silence, in contradiction, in the ache of not knowing. It takes root in those uncertain spaces where you're no longer performing, where you finally stop trying to impress people who never saw the truth of you anyway. That's where your education begins, not in the classroom, but in the mirror. Not in the answers, but in the courage to ask again and again, what is real for me? You start to realize that education isn't limited to a chapter in your life. It's the whole book. And the most important lessons aren't about history or mathematics. They're about how to live, how to face heartbreak without breaking yourself, how to be still when the world demands movement, how to speak honestly when silence is safer. These are the lessons that matter. And the irony is, they're the ones nobody teaches you. Nobody tells you how to recover from betrayal, how to hold grief in your chest without being swallowed, how to forgive someone who's not sorry. You were taught everything except how to be human. And so now, in the middle of your adult life, you're left with the task of becoming one, fully, bravely, honestly. That process doesn't look like success. It looks like slowing down when the world speeds up. It looks like turning off the noise and sitting with your own. It looks like unlearning the idea that every moment must be productive, that your value is in what you do, that rest is a reward and not a birthright. You begin to reclaim time, not just minutes or hours, but sacred time. The kind of time you spend not chasing something, but listening, not running forward, but sinking in. Because the wisdom you're looking for doesn't live in the future. It's here, inside you, right now. It always was. But it takes time to hear it again, after years of drowning in deadlines and data. You begin to see how much of your life was shaped by fear. Fear of failing, of disappointing, of being misunderstood. And slowly, you start choosing differently. Not because you no longer feel fear, but because you're tired of letting it dictate the shape of your existence. You start telling the truth, not just to others, but to yourself. You admit the jobs that drained you, the relationships you stayed in too long, the dreams you postponed because they didn't look practical. You look at your life with honest eyes, not to shame yourself, but to understand, to gather the pieces, to begin again, not from scratch, but from truth. And as you do this, something shifts. The world doesn't get easier, but your relationship to it becomes clearer. You no longer need to chase validation. You no longer shrink yourself to fit into rooms that never honored you. You become more intentional about what you say yes to, about where your energy goes, about who you let shape your thoughts. You realize that just because something is normal doesn't mean it's right. That just because everyone is running doesn't mean you have to. You learn to walk slowly, consciously, deeply into your own rhythm. That rhythm might look strange to others. They may not understand why you left the job that paid well or the city everyone wanted to live in. They might question why you spend hours alone, why you read strange books, why you ask questions that don't have answers. Let them wonder, because they're not supposed to understand your path. It's not theirs to walk. The people who matter, the ones who see you, really see you. They'll feel it. They'll recognize the light in your eyes when you're finally aligned. They'll notice the peace in your presence when you're no longer pretending. And that's when you'll know you're not alone, that there are others who have broken out of the same mold, others who chose truth over performance, presence over applause. You might meet them at unexpected moments, in a quiet bookstore, in a passing conversation, in a shared glance of recognition, kindred spirits who carry the same scar of awakening. And when you find them, there's no need to explain. You speak the same language now, the language of questions, of silence, of depth. And together, without planning, you begin to create a new kind of education, not institutional, but organic, not imposed, but inspired. An education that begins with curiosity and ends in wisdom, one that honors the whole person, not just the intellect, but the heart, the soul, the strange and sacred journey of becoming. This is what it means to remember who you are, to unlearn the lies that were sold as truth, to reclaim your identity not from achievements but from alignment. You stop asking, "What should I do?" and start asking, "What feels honest?" You stop chasing goals and start creating meaning. And it doesn't happen overnight. Some days, you'll still fall into old habits. You'll catch yourself seeking approval or fearing judgment. That's okay. Awareness doesn't mean perfection. It means presence. It means noticing when you drift and choosing to return. You begin to live from a different place. Not from pressure, but from purpose. Not from expectation, but from essence. And when that shift happens, even the smallest actions carry weight. A walk becomes meditation. A conversation becomes sacred. A single moment of honesty becomes a revolution. You no longer need to prove yourself. You just need to be yourself. And that's the kind of presence that changes everything. Not through force, but through clarity. In this clarity, you find compassion for yourself, for the younger version of you who didn't know better, for the people still trapped in the system. You don't judge them, you understand, because you were there too. And maybe in your own quiet way you can help light the path for someone else, not by preaching, not by correcting, but by being, by embodying what it looks like to live awake in a world that rewards sleepwalking. That's how the real education spreads, not through institutions, but through individuals who choose truth over tradition, awareness over automation, soul over script. You begin to look back, not with regret, but with recognition. You see the child you once were, the one who asked too many questions, who saw beauty in strange places, who felt everything deeply. That child wasn't broken. That child was wise. They just lived in a world that didn't know how to honor their wisdom. But now you do, and you carry them with you. You let them guide you. because they still remember the truth, the wonder, the joy of learning that comes not from fear, but from freedom. And you carry that forward, not just for yourself, but for others, for the next generation, for the ones who are still growing, still forming, still deciding who they are. You show them, by example, that they are allowed to ask questions, that they are allowed to feel, that their worth is not in their grades or their trophies or their ability to conform, but in their being, in their ability to sit in the unknown and trust themselves anyway, in their capacity to be kind in a world that rewards cruelty, to be honest in a world that celebrates masks. You teach not by instruction, but by presence. And in doing so, you become a different kind of educator, a guide, a mirror, a witness, someone who doesn't just know facts, but knows how to live, someone who doesn't just recite wisdom, but embodies it, someone who remembers that the most important lesson is not found in books, but in hearts, in the quiet places where people dare to be real. And maybe that's the future of education, not schools filled with answers, but lives filled with questions, not institutions built on control, but communities built on curiosity, not success defined by accolades, but by alignment. A world where people are taught not just how to make a living, but how to make a life. Where the measure of intelligence is not your ability to repeat, but your willingness to reflect. Where the goal is not perfection, but presence. That world begins with you, with your willingness to unlearn, to feel, to remember, to become, not someone new, but someone true. Because you were never meant to be a product of the system. You were meant to be a person, a soul, a light. And no degree, no institution, no authority can define that for you. Only you can. Only you must. So take this as your moment, not to fix yourself, but to reclaim yourself. To stop running from the questions and start living inside them. To trust that you are not behind. You are exactly where you're supposed to be. And from here, everything can change. Not because someone told you to, but because you remembered how. That is the lesson that matters. The one that lasts, the one that liberates, that education is yours now, and no one can take it from you ever again.